Fukushima Coverup. Robert, welcome to Radio EcoShock.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Good. I'm glad to have you here. Let's dive right into the cover-up you write about when the mainstream doesn't. I'd like to tell listeners that the Asahi Shimbun newspaper is like the New York Times of Japan, except Asahi has 3 times the circulation, over 7 million daily versus about 2 million for the New York Times. So, Robert, what happened at this huge daily newspaper in Japan when it comes to coverage of Fukushima?
Well, they were shut down. In fact, the year 2013 is the big cover-up year in Japan. That's when the Orwellian dream came true, and the land of the rising sun decided to go to 100% totalitarianism. Of course, Abe's administration came in the year before, in 2012. 2013 is the big cover-up year. They decided to put a cover on this entire nuclear disaster. And what happened with the Asahi Shimbun newspaper is that they had dedicated a staff of 30 journalists to cover the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and they were shut down in 2013. Now, they had written articles criticizing the state secrecy law. There are 3 things that happened in that year, 2013, that point in the direction of major cover-up. One is the shutdown of the journalistic team at Asahi Shimbun newspaper. Secondly, Japan passed a secrecy law, basically that says whatever an accuser claims to be secret is secret as long as they're a bureaucrat that makes the claim. And as a matter of fact, taking it to a further extent, if you're a journalist and if you simply inquire about what's designated as a state secret, you could be subject to going to jail in Japan. The third thing that happened is that they were awarded the Olympics, which is the greatest cover ever for a major nuclear disaster because it makes it appear to the world that, hey, everything's A-OK. Come on over hundreds of thousands of people to Fukushima, where, in fact, they plan on having some of the Olympic events like baseball and soccer. And they'll be fed food from Fukushima. Fukushima was one of the great agricultural regions of Japan, by the way. Meanwhile, you've got an active nuclear plant that is active fission, atom splitting. It's not likely to ever be recovered. When I say never recovered, you have 600 tons of melted fuel from the 3 reactors that had total 100% meltdown. And according to Greg Jesko, who was the former head of the U.S. NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it's not likely they will ever recover that. And nobody knows where the fuel is. So this is something that's very radioactive, and it will be for decades. So this is one of the biggest cover-ups of our lifetime. It's one of the biggest industrial disasters of our lifetime. There are going to be a lot of people who suffer. And, of course, another part of the cover-up, Alex, I've seen several articles in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, and Forbes, where these pro-nuke writers talk about, well, there are no deaths, maybe 1 death as a result of this meltdown. And they go on and on about how this really shows how safe nuclear power really is. Well, baloney. I have several contacts I know of in Japan who gainsay that. The mayor of Futaba, and I've written about this several times. In fact, I would recommend to your listeners that they read an article that I had published in September of 2015. The title of it is The Fukushima Fix. The Fukushima Fix. That is a very thorough article that goes into a lot of what we're talking about. But in terms of deaths in Japan, there have been many. The mayor of Futaba, which is one of the cities in the Fukushima area that was evacuated, actually made a public statement at one point that many people are dying and his own government is lying about it. There's a Buddhist temple not too far from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. There's a monk there named Kinoshita, and he has cremated ashes, several ashes of workers from the Fukushima plant. And of course, what happens at the Fukushima plant is that TEPCO, which is Tokyo Electric Power Company, doesn't report deaths of workers. And they say there haven't been any. Well, the reason they do that is twofold. One is that they use subcontractors to do all the cleanup work. Well, the subcontractors are not obligated to report the deaths on behalf of TEPCO. Secondly, the second thing that happens is if you're a worker and if you've been zapped by way too much radiation, if you get radiation illness, do you think you're well enough to go to work before you die, to die at the work site? No, you're not. You're in bed suffering, and that's when you die, and they don't report it. A journalist, independent journalist in Japan named Mako Chidori, who I've had contact with, interviewed a nurse who resigned from TEPCO. And that nurse told her that there have been many, many deaths of workers at the plant that are not reported. Now it's interesting, going back to the Orwellian dream that's being realized here in the land of the rising sun. Mako Chidori of Free Press Corporation in Japan was interviewed in Germany about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And one of the things she said really struck me. She said, there's one thing that really surprises me here in Europe. It's the fact that people here think Japan is a very democratic and free country. Well, it's not. It's a totalitarian state that has been put together over the last couple of years to hide the biggest disaster in human history. I wrote an article about a gentleman, speaking of deaths as a result of this, named Dr. Josh Parks. And the title of the article, and the article was in June of 2015, title of the article is Dr. Josh Parks' Courage at Fukushima. He was a missionary, and he had worked for decades in Japan with the indigent people in the streets and helping people out. He actually set up a street chapel for the homeless, in fact, and revered among the people they're homeless people in Japan. And he and his partner immediately went to help when Fukushima took place. He passed away from cancer, as did his partner a couple of years ago, and I wrote a memorial to him, and that's the article I just referred to. So this is an ongoing disaster that is not going to quit during our lifetime, and it's going to have unbelievable impact for years and years. You know, Alex, in that article that you mentioned at the top of this show about my most recent, the Fukushima Coverup article, I intentionally put 2 paragraphs at the end of that article that I think will really ring a bell with people. And it talks about Chernobyl because, you know, Chernobyl happened 30 years ago. And I thought it was fascinating that the USA Today newspaper on April the 17th of this year had an article entitled Chernobyl's Legacy, Kids with Bodies Ravaged by Disaster. Kids with bodies ravaged by disaster. And what they said in that article is that there are about 2.4 million people today in the Ukraine that they're registered with the health ministry to receive ongoing Chernobyl-related health care. And of those 2.5 million people, nearly 1.5 million, actually it's 453,000, are children, none of them born at the time of the accident. Their parents were children in 1986. And these children have a range of illnesses: respiratory, digestive, musculoskeletal, eye diseases, blood diseases, cancer, congenital malformations, all kinds of abnormalities. And here you have a newspaper, USA Today, which is considered kind of a neutral magazine. I don't know if they have a real political bent to them or not, but they typically aren't political. And they put out that article. That, to me, tells the whole story.
Well, you know, we've heard about that from Dr. Helen Caldicott. We've had her on the show. She's talked about transgenerational damage of nuclear exposure, and there were put-downs and catcalls from official experts in several countries. And the thing is, you know, we know it's basic science. It's taught in every biology class that radiation causes transgenerational damage to fruit flies, to animals, but somehow the Japanese want us to believe that humans are exempt.
Yeah, they do, don't they? Yeah, isn't that amazing? One of the saddest things, too, Alex, is that they're they're going in and they're going ahead and they're having people that had evacuated move back in. And what the Abe government's done is when they evacuated 160,000 people from that greater area around Fukushima, they did provide compensation to those people. Well, now they're saying as soon as the cleanup is finished in your area, your compensation stops. So now you're a family that had to leave 5 years ago, go live in a schoolhouse or wherever it was, abandoned from your home. Now they're not going to give you compensation any longer. Your whole life has been upset, and they're going to move you back into an area where they say that it's been cleaned up. Well, I'm here to tell everybody who's listening, those areas are not decontaminated the way they say they are. And how do I know that? I know that because of Greenpeace. And I suggest a film that people can go to on YouTube. It's called Fukushima Living with Disaster. Fukushima Living with Disaster. If you put that into YouTube, you'll see about a 20-minute film that actually shows in real time radiation tests taking place by Greenpeace workers in Japan in areas where the Japanese government claims that it's been decontaminated and that people can move back in. And there are hotspots all over the place. The other problem, Alex, with the whole Fukushima area is it's a myth that the government can go in and clean this up. They've got 40,000 workers who've gone out and tried, and you got to give them credit for making an effort, but they've taken topsoil and put it into these 1-ton black bags. They've got enough black bags full of this contaminated soil that could extend end to end from Los Angeles to Tokyo, and they've only got about half the job done, but yet the job they've done is not complete at any rate. There are hot spots everywhere. 60% of Fukushima is forest, mountains, hills, valleys, meadows. None of that has been touched, and that all runs back onto the contaminated areas over time. The other thing that's just been recently uncovered that is really a disaster, there are 10 major dams in Fukushima that provide the water supply for agriculture and drinking. And they have discovered at the bottom of those dams extraordinarily high levels of cesium-137, which is one of the isotopes that's produced when you have nuclear fission. Cesium-137 is 1,000,000 times more poisonous than anything you can think of. 1 gram, which is about the size of a dime, of cesium-137 spread evenly over 1 square mile, will make that uninhabitable for 100 years, 1 gram. Now, at the bottom of these dams, very bottom of the dams, it has accumulated, and the readings are, in some instances, 30,000, some instances 70,000 becquerels per kilogram. Drinking water standards in Japan now are 200 becquerels of radioactivity per kilogram, and here you've got 30,000, 60,000. Now, what the authorities have decided is that at the very top water level of these dams, it's a lower amount. So they're continuing to use it for both drinking water and for agriculture. They should shut down that entire area the same as Chernobyl did. Chernobyl has a 1,000 square mile prohibited region that's going to be shut down for maybe hundreds of years. So it's a story that hasn't stopped. It's not in the news. It hasn't stopped, and it only gets worse because they cannot locate a major meltdown, the corium, that's sizzling hot, and that puts out isotopes that can actually, if it burrows through, if it has burrowed through the containment vessels and into the earth, I don't think anyone knows what will happen. We've never had this happen before in the history of humankind. This whole thing's an experiment. And they're playing with fire. And here you've got a totalitarian government now that's playing with people's lives.